This is episode 419 of That Shakespeare Life.
Well, hi, I'm Nigel Wood. I'm Professor of Literature at Loughborough University. Another great method for studying the history of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
For the 16th century, a vagrant was someone who operated outside of societal norms. It was anyone who moved around without a fixed home or produced a profit without the oversight of a noble patron. In a culture that highly prized both hierarchy and organization, someone who fell outside these categories was cast under severe scrutiny. They were seen as a potential threat and could even face harsh punishments specifically aimed at preventing vagrancy from existing at all. During Shakespeare's lifetime, new laws were being passed to aggressively define and control the vagrant. They casted a net that often saw players and playwrights like William Shakespeare get caught right up in the chaos. To help us understand how these categories worked and why they mattered, we're joined this week by Dr. David Hitchcock, reader in early modern history at Canterbury Christ Church University. Dr. Hitchcock's research focuses on poverty, mobility, and the cultural meaning of vagrancy in early modern England. He's here today to help us explore why early modern England was so focused on vagrancy, what the laws were that tried to prevent it, and how effective they might have been, as well as how these laws impacted theater and Shakespeare specifically. Hello, Dave. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. It's a delight to be with you today.
Why did vagrancy become such a pressing issue in Shakespeare's England? What social or economic conditions made the authorities feel like this was a big enough problem that they needed to pursue this serious legislation?
So Shakespeare lived in a time of remarkable social and economic and cultural change. We have, from the middle to the end of the 16th century, that whole 50-year period, significant population growth. So the sort of size of the country of England is getting bigger in terms of people. We have regular issues around harvests and food prices going up. So it is more expensive. It's essentially a cost of living crisis. It is more expensive for people to get by in many of these decades, most famously in the 1590s, when Shakespeare would have been at his busiest in London. He would have probably seen in London the effects of that on the street and, out and about. He would have probably seen quite a lot of street poverty and a lot of potential, people suffering in public. We also have conflict. England is at war with Spain for a very long time in this period, pretty much from the invasion, the attempted invasion, the Spanish Armada in the late 1580s, right the way through past the death of Elizabeth into the reign of James I. We have trade depressions. So it's not a great time, for instance, to be a weaver working in textiles. We have blockades, we have piracy, it's all sorts. We also have political instability. So waves of popular protest, often against enclosure of common land. So this is essentially land that is for collective use in a lot of the rural communities all around England, and landlords are getting pieces of legislation passed which essentially privatize that land, which takes it out of the use of, out of the hands of the poorer sort. People are complaining all through the period about a kind of decline in charity and hospitality. People are sort of regarded or see their times as meaner, less charitable. And we have this new population of people who've been buffeted by all these things, right? They are poor, they're mobile, they're usually but not always young, they are often but not always men, and they are usually moving around in search of work, usually in husbandry or agriculture, taking in the harvest, that kind of thing. And the law calls these people vagrants, among other things. They're regarded as a threatening group, as we can discuss later on. So that context was something Shakespeare was born into and actually lived all the way through as well. So he would have been very familiar with many of those challenges, and many of his plays actually reflect them.
With it being something that so heavily impacted Shakespeare's life, I was really surprised that I wasn't actually able to find Shakespeare using the word vagrant in his plays. Is that actually the term that people would have used in his lifetime, particularly in the context of the laws, or would an Elizabethan audience have recognized these individuals with different language?
You're right. He doesn't use the word vagrant at all. That's partly because vagrant is, in fact, a legal term. So it mostly shows up in the laws rather than in other sort of types of document. Every once in a while, we'll see it in the printed pamphlets and kind of printed literature of the age, in effect. But Shakespeare loved to use a word that's very closely connected. By my count, in his plays and his poems, he uses the word rogue 73 times. And rogue and vagabond and sturdy beggar are the trifecta of cultural terms, I suppose, that are really closely associated with vagrancy. So works like Thomas Harmon's Caveat for Common Cursitors, books like A Highway to the Spitalhouse from the 1530s, introduced this word, rogue, to the English language. It's a neologism in the 16th century. And it's frankly quite an exciting term. People are throwing it around as an insult all the time. And it essentially, as you might, I'm sure it just essentially means you're a lowlife, right? You're a deceptive, dishonest, vaguely criminal lowlife. And that sort of bleeds into a lot of the legislation. So you actually get Elizabethan statutes that, they'll be about vagrants and they'll use the word vagrancy. But when they are opining on which groups are meant to be caught by this law, they'll say things like rogues, vagabonds, and sturdy beggars, borrowing directly from the literature, from the material. So we have, plenty of Elizabethans, potentially Shakespeare, although I don't have any sort of evidence to prove this, wandering around London insulting each other as thou rogue. We have plenty of people who also would have recognized actual vagrants or actual mobile poor people, in person when they met them. And so many archives, hundreds of thousands, which detail kind of casual relief and casual punishment and just the ways that Elizabethans interacted with the mobile poor all through the period. So yeah, there's a real separation of those terms. One is essentially a term of art and one is a term of law.
As Dave points out in his research on vagrancy for this period, Shakespeare's lifetime was a time of major changes to the laws about vagrancy. Dave, what measures were instituted during Shakespeare's lifetime, and why were they so significantly different than what had been done before?
This is another really good question. So part of the answer here is that newness of the sort of difficult context of the later 16th century, just the sheer number of things which were sort of simultaneously challenging people. Also, these laws are often early modern elaborations on medieval statutes. We have statutes going all the way back to the 12th and 13th century, which are very similar in their aims. Sort of essentially immediately after the Black Death, we have complaints about this population of mobile men. It's just that they, by number, they aren't yet that big of a threat. So listeners will know, I'm sure, Shakespeare is born in 1564. He dies in 1616. Christopher Marlowe, who's another famous playwright, actually from Canterbury, which is where I am right now, was born the same year, right? Famously, as Shakespeare. These men are sort of quintessentially Elizabethan, and they came of age in that era that I'm discussing. And during that era, the problem of poverty sort of gets rediscovered. It becomes more visible on the street, it becomes more acute. And the stage, not just Shakespeare, but the whole Elizabethan stage really reflects this in all sorts of interesting ways. So we have people like Thomas Dekker, Middleton, Ben Jonson, where their plays are stuffed to the gills with all sorts of interesting lower order characters. And we have major legislative attempts to deal with all of this as well. So right the year before he's born, we have the 1563 Statute of Artificers, which is essentially the first attempt to regulate wages in Elizabethan England in a national way. So it essentially made it illegal to ask for too much when you were working in these sort of lower order jobs. We have a 1572 law, which is the first Elizabethan Parliament's attempt at a vagrancy law. We have the old poor laws in 1597 and 98, and then they're changed again in 1603. Practically every year of James I's reign in the early 17th century, when Shakespeare was into his middle age, there's some kind of social legislation or royal proclamation or some other attempt to deal with the issue. We also have a new institution which makes its debut in this period, the House of Correction, which is essentially a prison for poor people, more or less. You could be put in there for other reasons, forms of social crime, illicit trading, unlicensed activity of various kinds, deception. But as an institution, they're all modeled in England on Bridewell, which was a former royal palace donated to the city of London for this purpose by the government of Edward VI in the mid-century. And these houses of correction start becoming very popular. Counties and cities open them with increasing frequency in this period. And we start to see in the archives of them a real increase in volume. They really are starting to take in a large number of poor people. We also have major proposals, including directly to Queen Elizabeth herself, by a guy called Richard Hakluyt in the 1580s, to send large populations of poor people overseas, essentially penal transportation. That is most famously associated with Australia and convict transport far into the 18th century, but actually they are thinking about it very acutely and occasionally trying it in the later 16th century. So there's a bunch of things that makes it all different. Firstly, the legislative attempts are very national attempts. They are conceived of as attempts to deal with this problem across the nation as such. That's quite a departure. And actually, England in particular is distinct in this way from many other continental European powers, where we see many of the same initiatives, but usually confined to a city or some kind of local urban context. Secondly, I would argue, and I think others have as well, that the sort of way people imagine solving this problem becomes increasingly colonial, transatlantic. Elizabethans are starting to think about the possibilities of sort of exporting their problems, in effect, which they will go on to do. Stuarts will go on to do in the 17th century, using indentured servitude, colonization in Virginia, and so on. And thirdly, a lot of these poor, workless men and some women, the problems affecting them get so acute that increasingly in the 17th century, at the end of Shakespeare's life, entire families are sort of uprooted and are moving around in search of work and subsistence, almost like a kind of 17th century version of the Great Depression. Shakespeare really does live through it. Quite an intense period of trying to come to grips with these sort of new issues of poverty and mobility and vagrancy.
When lawmakers responded, what measures did they actually put in place? Were there rules, limits, or what were the punishments under the vagrancy statutes?
So vagrancy statutes on paper are very harsh. In the archives, they are less harsh. So when they are enacted, when constables or justices of the peace or other legal officials are on the ground dealing with an actual homeless person or someone in search of work, it's less intense. But on paper, theoretically, when you were arrested as a vagrant, you were supposed to be marched back to your parish of origin. And while you were being marched back, you were supposed to be whipped publicly at the cart's tail every time you stopped, which is pretty brutal. A lot of authors looking at the Tudor period sort of get hung up on another statute, which is sort of famous for all the wrong reasons. Sort of early in the reign of Edward VI, there's a law which sort of said that vagrants could be enslaved, in effect indentured arbitrarily, by whoever caught them. I've actually seen almost no evidence that this occurred in practice, but it certainly seems to have been allowed in the legislation. And much, much later, well beyond the period we're discussing today, at the end of the 17th century, there is a similar law in Scotland as well, suggesting that Scottish vagrants could be enslaved or indentured this way. So the main rule or the main limit amongst all of these laws was that poor travelers had to have a good reason for traveling. The contemporary language was to give good account of oneself, in effect, to have an acceptable reason. So if you couldn't do that, you were unable to give a good account of yourself, you risked arrest as a vagrant if you were in that position. So I often imagine poor travelers, mobile poor folks, moving around in search of work, trying to find a place in husbandry or service or whatever. And they get really good, I imagine, at justifying their movements to really beady-eyed parish constables, the dogberries of the realm on a regular basis, right? And if you actually were a servant, you could risk vagrancy arrest, even though you'd just been employed. If you were an apprentice, the same went, because basically you needed paperwork. If you didn't have your paperwork or some way of saying, oh, no, my master's over here on such and such a street in London, the person who was sort of accosting you might not believe you and might arrest you for vagrancy on the spot. So if you were a servant departing from your former master, you were supposed to have some kind of testimonial paperwork, essentially. And there was a little cottage industry of forgeries, as a matter of fact, in the 16th century, essentially giving people who had no reason to move around a pretend reason to do so. So licenses, patents to gather money for imprisoned debtors or what have you, recovering losses from a fire, etc. All of that grows to a very outsized importance on stage and in the literature. But there is some evidence that it's real. We have some good research on it. So the other thing about this is that actually the existence of all that low-level deception and forgery, infrequent but still interesting, it actually tells us we are looking at a system which is increasingly dependent on showing proof, a kind of papers, please situation. So if you're caught, you can be imprisoned in a house of correction, you can be whipped, you can be sent home, wherever home is. In practice, what I've found, particularly in the 17th century and beyond, is that most vagrants, most of the time, were simply moved on. They might be given a bit of casual relief. They might be imprisoned, like held still, immobilized, to be sent home. But that is the vast majority of what happens for the most part. It's essentially Greyhound, so-called Greyhound therapy, except in the 17th century. Increasingly, though, when you are stuck in one of these institutions, we start to see some of the more iconic punishments of the period. So hard labor, right? Picking oakum or fashioning rope or doing some other sort of tedious task that requires a lot of hands. And all of this could be done, in effect, at the discretion of magistrates and constables. It was all done on what's called suspicion of someone being a vagrant. And so actually the burden of proof was very low. It didn't require a lot of evidence to arrest someone or hold someone for this crime.
So in addition to making sure you have your papers, you better not make anybody angry because it was highly subjective to their general opinion of you, it sounds like.
Absolutely. And so there's this whole ritual you need to go through on a regular basis to give a kind of respectable account of yourself, the reasons you're moving. And that applied to more than just vagrants and mobile poor folks. In many ways, almost everybody in the lower orders who wasn't immediately obviously a member of the gentry or above would have probably had to do something similar when they moved around. It was probably a function of travel. I'll end with one last point here, which is that all this kind of disciplining and punishing, it's increasingly justified as reformatory, as sort of fixing people, right? They're not putting them to hard labor just for the fun of it, right? The idea is that work will, quote unquote, set you free, make you useful, turn you into a kind of productive member of the Commonwealth when you are thought to be this idle sort of drone who's not contributing.
Well, tell me about the effectiveness here. I mean, the Elizabethan government and later the Stuart government were essentially using these laws to try and eliminate vagrancy. So did it work? Did these laws actually reduce vagrancy, or did they have unintended consequences?
It's a great question. This is one of those historical questions where it's hard to know for sure. But as with so much in history, the answer is sort of a bit of both. They were effective in certain ways. Whether they reduced vagrancy overall is almost impossible to measure, but I can come on to that in a second. And there were definitely unintended consequences. So all these measures, if you take them together across Shakespeare's lifetime and a little bit beyond it, they create a really big kind of judicial and carceral framework, right? They create a set of laws and institutions and assumptions which are about keeping you still, putting you in an institution, sending you home, right? This is the point of all of this. And it was an incredibly flexible regime, which, with various tweaks, essentially persists into the 20th century, past the creation of professional police forces, past a huge range of other social and economic changes. We still have, in effect, versions of the Elizabethan vagrancy laws, updated on a regular basis, but very little has changed. They get rid of the whipping bit. They do some other things, but everything else is pretty much there. Actually, the on suspicion stuff doesn't get struck down in the United States, for instance, until the 1970s. You can still use the vagrancy laws in the 20th century United States all the way up to then. So one of the other unintended consequences here is also colonial. vagrancy laws effectively become the basis for Caribbean and colonial slave codes in places like Barbados, Jamaica, Virginia, and elsewhere, because both codes in the first instance are about regulating mobility, people moving around who shouldn't be, right? Quote unquote, right? You want to control the movement of a particular population. Vagrancy laws give you a model for how to do that. And they're also quite punitive, right? And slave codes are very punitive. So these systems, initially based on vagrancy codes, then intensify, obviously become profoundly racialized, and go off in a kind of colonial plantation slavery direction. The vagrancy laws back home in the colonial metropole in England and, the UK after 1707 actually do a similar thing. So vagrancy laws are used to target Gypsy, Roma, and traveler populations in England all the way from the end of the 15th century, actually, right the way through, again, to the 20th century. They're using these laws to target these folks. They are using the laws to target poor Irish travelers. If you are able to be distinguished as from the island of Ireland and you're poor and you're out of work, you really do risk the vagrancy laws in this period. So the whole edifice is actually part of a bunch of bigger histories here. It sits at the heart of a whole bunch of the things that really do characterize this period. It's penal transportation, policing, unfreedom, colonial policy, all sorts, really. So many unintended consequences, many developments, but the heart of the system remains remarkably stable over a very long period.
While you're listening to David describe vagrancy and the laws about them for Shakespeare's lifetime, you can see companion visuals of these laws and illustrations of what vagrancy looked like for Shakespeare's lifetime, as well as access primary documents related to this topic, all straight from the 16th and 17th century right now by clicking the episode page and selecting That Shakespeare Society. Inside That Shakespeare Society, members can access detailed history for every episode that includes bonus content we can't fit into the conversation, along with a vibrant comment section where you can ask questions directly to our guest. To access this week's bonus content and ask questions to David yourself, visit CassidyCash.com/EP419 and click on That Shakespeare Society. And now back to the show. All of these definitions of vagrants and what they were and how they were functioning, I'm confused a bit as to why players and playwrights got included in this category. Can you explain that, Bridge?
I can. This is one of those funny, we get these things sometimes in legal and criminal history where categories are simply added to existing laws, right?
Just tacked on there.
We would literally, when I tallied them up in the mid-17th century, there were 40 different categories of person who technically were subject to the vagrancy laws, including people who baited bears for entertainment, people who read your palm at the fair, and yes, unlicensed players, actors, and minstrels. So the point here is about sort of the pre-modern definition of social disturbance or social crime and who gets to make that distinction, right? For whom, is this a disturbance? So really, these are public, loud, interesting, engaging professions which are about capturing attention in public space, right? That's really, at the end of the day, what actors, playwrights, whether you're doing it on stage or on the street is an important distinction, but it's the same skill set. So a guy with a notice board around his neck yelling dramatic advertisements for fish in a London market will need to give the same account of his legitimacy, or plenty of women do this too, so her legitimacy, or else they risk arrest under these laws. So disturbing the peace is kind of where they're coming from in a lot of this. With acting in particular, there's another issue as well, which is Elizabethan anxieties over something they call false facing, which is in effect the Ocean's 11 style ability to pretend that you are a class of person that you're not, to affect the mannerisms, erudition, and behaviors of a gentry, for instance, and fake your way into social settings or even inside buildings, perhaps, where you really shouldn't be. So that's a status anxiety that Elizabethans are increasingly cognizant of, and players of interludes and actors and playwrights kind of, again, are thought to have a set of skills that apply to that kind of thing. The other major thing here is patronage, right? So actors without patronage are not actually in legitimate employment. They would, in effect, be masterless men because they don't have a patron. So that makes them subject to the laws in that way. there's a bunch of ways this could happen. The other thing about acting in this period, and even writing plays to an extent, is that it's a bit of a seedy business, right? It hasn't yet become the genteel pursuit that we'll see in the post-Garrick, right? Like, he really does sort of redeem the profession in a way. Into the 19th and 20th century, it becomes more of a pursuit of the upper classes. But in this period, with a few exceptions, the men, mainly men writing plays until the 17th century, they're middle class or slightly, upperly mobile, lower class, even to an extent. So that does make it all a bit suspect and subject to these anxieties. Now, when it's actually added to the laws is an interesting question. I couldn't immediately find the answer to that, to be honest. I went and looked. It is there by 1662. So I do know for my period, well after, about 50 years after Shakespeare dies, it is there. I think it's also there in some version in the 1572 laws as well, where it sort of says players of interludes, and it's a bigger category, essentially, because interludes could be music, it could be short plays, could be sort of street side entertainment. So it is a sort of complex milieu that these people get thrown into and risk, they sort of risk things happening to them on a regular basis.
Do we know if Shakespeare was ever impacted directly by these vagrancy laws, or if not Shakespeare himself, contemporary playwrights like him?
So far as we know, our young genius is never dinged by the vagrancy laws. If he was, it probably would have been during the so-called lost years. This is a sort of period in the mid-1580s into the early 1590s, immediately after his twin kids are born, where there seems very limited evidence of what he's doing. I do think it's unlikely, though. First of all, by that point, William Shakespeare is married, he has children, he's a family man. He also has a profession and a sort of reason for moving around, which he can declare. And it is actually single men that are regarded as more threatening rather than married men. Secondly, if he's in London, he's probably already acting, although obviously in this period it's hard to know. We don't have good archives. He's in a context, therefore, where these vagrancy laws are pretty much unenforceable against the kind of technical number of people who you could enforce them against in London. It's very unlikely that London's constables are wandering around singling out actors in this period for imprisonment. So it's really only when someone with a similar skill set intruded in some way on the sensibilities of elites that they risked arrest. And I think Shakespeare is probably way too smart for that, to be honest. Other playwrights, again, it's unlikely. I haven't seen any evidence that Dekker, Middleton, Fletcher, any of these folks, definitely not Johnson, have been done by the laws. But we do have one fellow in the early 17th century, a guy called John Taylor, the so-called water poet, who was also a Thames boatman and almost certainly came from very humble origins. And he actually pens several pieces which suggest he's very familiar with the vagrancy laws, including a little pamphlet called The Praise, Antiquity, and Commodity of Begging. And then Ben Jonson clearly knew his way around, certainly around rogue literature and probably around the laws as well. His plays are stuffed to the gills with kind of London.
He was arrested enough for other things. He probably knew a lot about the legal system.
Well, exactly, right? So, he really likes getting into fights, right? So there's plenty of other ways that these playwrights can get in trouble. Ben Jonson's yes, exactly. So I think the answer here is that these are colorful men. They are interesting men, but actually they are not directly at risk of getting arrested for vagrancy. That said, there is another population of sort of similarly artistically inclined men who are really at risk, and that is ballad writers. So the guys who are kind of penning the pop songs of the era on the back of waste paper and getting them printed by the thousands to saturate London's musical market, those guys were profoundly at risk of getting arrested or getting troubled by the vagrancy laws. And we know this because there's a very famous balladeer called Martin Parker in the early 17th century who writes a few songs pretty much demonstrating that he'd had firsthand experience with all of this.
Well, if ballads were an example of this roguery, shall we say, or if players could be treated as vagrants, what are we supposed to think about Shakespeare using ballads in his plays? How should we understand this overlap in terms of what you're telling us about the vagrancy and the laws that placed players at risk of punishment?
I love this question. It speaks to something really important about all of this, about Shakespeare's time, about his plays. Of course, plays had to appeal across a big diverse set of social classes in the audience, right? Shakespeare had to get the groundlings roaring, and he had to give the box seats something delightful to chew over at the same time. And everybody loved a ballad in this period. And that's true all the way through the 16th and 17th century into the 18th. They changed shape, but they are the sort of definitive musical format of the masses all through this period. Everybody sings them. They're sold all over. They're dirt cheap. They feature extensively in taverns and alehouses in the streets. People use them as advertisements for their businesses, all sorts. And there's a lot of ballads that make use of rogue literature as well in the songs, in the stories. I've counted just shy of about 100 different songs that are playing with many of the same characters and stereotypes as, you know, the more sort of upmarket pieces of pamphlet literature. So Shakespeare would have definitely encountered all of this over his, you know, duration of stay in London as an actor and a playwright. I mean, it's pretty clear from plays like The Winter's Tale and from a range of other roguish characters that he knew his way around these stereotypes. And he inserts ballads, as you say, into a range of his more comedic plays, which is really where they belong, frankly. Ballads are usually quite funny. So that whole context is something that the Jacobean theater, the Elizabethan theater was alive to, reflecting constantly, because of course it was popular. It was commercially sensible to do this, right? To draw in audiences with, frankly, all the same things that sell today, right? Gossip, rumors, racy plot lines, violence. I mean, you know, everything that we like in our cultural entertainments today, people liked then. And rogue literature is, again, stuffed to the back teeth with all of these things. So I think that's a big part of what's going on. The other thing that's going on is that Elizabethans are starting to imagine into existence a kind of underworld as well. And Shakespeare doesn't play with the underworld tropes quite as much as some other playwrights do. Most famously, Dekker and Middleton write a play called The Roaring Girl, which is about a real woman named Mary Frith, who's essentially sort of regarded as the sort of queen of London's 17th century underworld. So these things are enormously popular, and Shakespeare was as commercially minded and sensitive and engaged with his audiences as any other playwright, arguably more than many of them, and so will have reflected what they wanted back to them. And we can see that in so many of his characters. So yeah, plays are a fantastic way of thinking about all of this together, thinking about the way that by adding a ballad, it makes the play more legible to a certain segment of your audience, while at the same time giving the elites in the boxes maybe a little frisson. They're roughing it, you know, like, oh, we can enjoy a ballad while we're here, right? I'm sure that's part of what's going on when these playwrights are doing this.
Some of the characters in Shakespeare's plays that reflect this vagrancy, I would think would be Autolycus in The Winter's Tale, or Edgar disguised as Poor Tom. And there's other rogues and what you mentioned of masterless men in the Henry IV plays. When we see characters like this show up in Shakespeare's plays, are we applying an understanding of vagrancy to these characters after the fact? Or when they first appeared on the stage, would Shakespeare's audience have gone, oh, I recognize that character and I know, you know, they're breaking this law, or this is a reflection of this over here? Would those connections have been made in the moment the characters were first portrayed?
I don't know that they would have leapt straight to the laws per se, but there's a lot of slippage between many of these sort of character stereotypes. And that's in many ways one of the appeals of all of this, right? The sort of role switching, the code switching that happens all through. And indeed, too, many of these characters, right? So Edgar is so compelling as Poor Tom precisely because of the adopted disguise, right? And actually, I mean, it's interesting because King Lear is my favorite play. I love King Lear. And Edgar as Poor Tom and Lear himself on the heath, right? Evicted and alone, basically, except for his fool. These are actually quite profound, very serious meditations on the miseries and traumas of extreme poverty and indeed of homelessness, right? Lear is evicted. And yes, we cannot forget as an audience that Lear was a king, but it really is emphasis on was. And what's so striking about these scenes is how sort of solitary they are, how intense the pathos is in them. And actually, I think I mean, authorial intention is obviously notoriously slippery, right? But I think that's deliberate. I think that's Shakespeare saying, I understand this, I sympathize, I know my audience will as well. Yes, maybe it's easier to make people sympathize when it's elite characters who are reduced to extreme poverty, but even so, there's a real pathos there. The other thing here, when it comes to comedy and the sort of lighter side of things, so Autolycus, Winter's Tale, As You Like It, and indeed there's some comedy inside the Henry plays as well, and Falstaff really takes center stage there, doesn't he? So when it comes to that stuff, these roguish figures are incredibly useful for playwrights and incredibly useful for audiences too. They're often drivers of the story in some really interesting ways. So Autolycus, I don't think, is there very long, right? In Winter's Tale, but he's garrulous. He actually helps resolve the plot. He's a bit of a petty thief. He wanders around, sings a few songs, gets everybody hot under the collar, and then leaves, right? And then we have some references in the Henry Fours to previous rebellions. We have, of course, Falstaff and his kind of roguish crew, and it's actually their banishment by Henry, which again shoves the plot forward and kind of says, okay, it's time for a new royal and social order here. So I think when we're thinking about Shakespeare's contemporaries, his audiences, they would have clocked these references 100%. The biggest and most obvious set of references is to roguish stereotypes and rogue literature. Many of these folks might have read translations from Spanish into English of very famous picaresque novels like Lazarillo de Tormes or Guzmán de Alfarache. These are like super popular Spanish novels and novellas, rogue literature, which have a very roguish kind of deceptive guy swindling everybody, swindling the priests, swindling the gentry, swindling nuns, etc., right? Going on adventures. These are enormously compelling, popular pieces of work. And in fact, they will end up becoming the kernel of what we now understand as the novel. They really do tee up the novel as a form of writing. So people would have been aware of that. And the other thing that they would have been aware of, folks in the 16th century and indeed beyond it, they lived sort of simultaneously both closer to the law, but also farther away from some of the law's effects, right? So we today live in countries where the presence of law is far more widespread and sort of in many ways far more visible. There are more police. There are more institutions associated with the laws. There are more buildings and places and physical things that remind us of law. And so there's a step back in time that we need to take to think about how law would have actually functioned in this period. And one of the big ways that it did was informally and interpersonally. So the vast majority of criminal behavior, which today might have sent someone into the police lockup or into small claims court or whatever, in this period it's resolved essentially out of court before it ever reaches court. And that's because pursuing cases at law is really expensive. You got to pay the judge, you got to pay fees, you got to give gifts, you got to pay your lawyer, you got to pay. And that is not something most people are capable of doing. So I think folks taking these plays in would have had a rich sort of set of possibilities in the back of their heads for interrogating these characters. But they also, remember, all of this is a bit about mockery, a bit about satire, right? I mean, Dogberry, the constable, isn't a rogue, but he's absolutely in the same bucket as Autolycus in many ways. He's meant to be funny. He's meant to be hapless. He's meant to be a caricature of a particular kind of busybody minor legal official. And that's why he's so funny. The As You Like It cast of exiles in the forest, they are not vagrants per se, but they are definitely mobile. They're definitely beyond the settled, established order. They are making merry and fooling around all over the place. They are partaking of many of the same tropes. So I think Shakespeare's plays are just full of it all, really, full of all this color. And I think personally that it's one of his biggest strengths as a playwright, this ability to portray all these different classes of people seriously and comedically, just interacting on stage.
Well, if someone wanted to keep exploring early modern vagrancy and to dive into this world, as you say, that is full of color and explore what there is to uncover behind the history here, where would you suggest we begin to learn more?
I think there's a couple of possibilities here. There's a lot of academic work on many of these things, certainly on Shakespeare, definitely on poverty and homelessness and vagrancy. Most of it is pretty easy to read, but it is long, it is a bit dense. Many of the answers many of the discussions we've been having today, I've been drawing on that work. In the popular off-the-shelf sort of bookstores of the United States or Europe or whatever, there are actually less pieces on offer, slightly ironically. There isn't really a good go-to recommendation here. Possibly The Swerve by Stephen Greenblatt. It touches on it a little bit. Many of the popular narrative histories of Shakespeare's time and into the 17th century will touch on these social questions. So Stanley Wells has written some interesting general sort of, pieces for the general interested reader on Shakespeare's age and what it was like. And he colors in the picture pretty well. That said, I think there's a real temptation amongst many folks to kind of pivot straight to the playwright himself, straight into the plays, which are in many ways the thing that fascinates people most. I am a historian. I would argue actually go the other direction first and read actually some of the primary sources. Try your hand reading the rogue literature. Lazarillo de Tormes is an amazing book. Really interesting plot, sets up so many of the kind of stereotypes and assumptions of the rest of the period around rogues and so on. There's a great little edited collection that people can get for cheap called Coney Catchers and Body Baskets, which is a sort of 1970s collection of all these little pieces of rogue literature. It's been nicely edited and put into book form. Folks can try their hand with the actual rogue literature itself. For people who are super keen, they can dig into the ballads that we've been discussing today on a website called the English Broadside Ballad Archive, which is actually run out of California, the University of California, Santa Barbara. It's been a long-running project there. They can even hear reconstructions of what some of these ballads may have sounded like from, people have sung them again for us today. And you can search in there. And you won't find a ton of Shakespeare, but interestingly enough, you will find some ballads about King Lear and a bunch of other stories that Shakespeare is clearly familiar with when he's writing his work for the stage. So those are all possibilities. I've also recommended a sort of set of books, none of which are too expensive. There's a really good collection from the early 2000s called Cast Out, which is it's sort of global history of vagrancy and homelessness. It can give people a really good comparative sense of what this might have been like in many different societies. And actually, that's very helpful. It helps to sharpen our understanding of what this might have been like in Shakespeare's England to think about what it might have been like in the Dust Bowl in the 20th century, what it might have been like in post-war Japan, early colonial South Africa, etc. These contexts matter because actually the similarities and the differences tell us something important about this condition, right, of being so poor and so mobile. So there are many possibilities here, and I'd be very happy to answer questions from your listeners more directly if they are really keen to get into this topic, because from where I'm sitting, the more the merrier. This is a really important aspect of understanding this whole period, which is why I'm so glad that we're talking about it today.
And before you get nervous about trying to dive into primary sources, expecting them to either be difficult to access, hard to find, or worried they might have complicated prints or Latin phrases you might not recognize right away, many primary sources are not only available online, but they're often translated into several languages. Your native language is usually available and printed in modern type. So finding out the history there is not as scary or as hard to access as you might expect it to be. And to help you get started on this research adventure, all of the links to the ballads database, the books and articles Dave's recommending for you today, including the primary documents he's suggesting you check out, are all linked in today's show notes. So be sure to stay tuned for the episode page URL today to find all of these things. Now, Dave, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
My choice is actually, it has nothing to do with my professional work. It has nothing to do with homelessness or poverty. It would probably be The Player of Games by Ian Banks, who is a science fiction writer from the UK who sadly passed away a little bit earlier in the 21st century, who writes far future speculative fiction about a sort of spacefaring civilization, you know, the type. But it's a remarkable universe he's created. It is immensely freeing to read about. And The Player of Games is one of my favorite books by him. It's a lovely little standalone piece of fiction and might well be known to many of your listeners. Ian Banks has a bit of a following. So I think I would take The Player of Games. It's one of the books I have reread the most over the years.
It's always good when stranded on a lost island to take a book with you that you enjoy for enjoyment's sake, I think, as keeping up spirits is pretty essential in that situation. So a great choice to choose one of your favorites. What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
So I am very slowly working on a second book, bringing together many of the themes we've touched on today. It's a transatlantic history of poverty in the United Kingdom, in actually the colonial United States and Canada as well, to a certain extent. And the book looks at, in effect, the reasons behind all the different policies, all the different laws, all the different proposals that the British Empire, the British state, attempted when it came to dealing with this problem, in scare quotes, right? This problem of the poor. And I'm making the argument, in effect, that modernity as we understand it, our concepts of welfare, our concepts of sort of deservingness, who deserves assistance, who is a legitimate citizen of the state, who is an outsider, who's an insider, many of the kind of issues that we have inherited, if you will, stem from this context. This, I think of it like a wheel. Wheels can be obviously famously both a implement of torture. You can be racked on the wheel, right? So poverty is traumatic, and it can be an engine of productivity, right? Wheels, water wheels, millstone wheels, and so on. It's one of the most kind of productive visual imageries of the period. So the book is called The Wheel of Poverty. At least that's what it's called at the moment. And it's taking in this big kind of transatlantic context to think with some big questions about the poor. So I'm not leaving my vagrants behind. They are very much still part of the story, but I'm enlarging my canvas to think about the ways that people like Shakespeare and many of his contemporaries, what they thought, right? And how they thought what they thought about the poorest in society, because I do think it's fundamentally important to the period, to understanding it. So that's what I'm excited about next.
How exciting. I know we're looking forward to hearing your new book and seeing what's uncovered there. We'll place links in the show notes today where you can follow Dave's work and keep tabs on when this next book is available so you can explore that history. And I know we are all looking forward to seeing that. Dave, thank you so much for being here this week and helping us understand vagrancy, exactly what it is and what it isn't for Shakespeare's lifetime and how that impacted the plays, the playwrights, and even William Shakespeare himself. I appreciate you being here to help us explore this topic today.
Thanks so much, Cassidy. It's been a real pleasure.
All of the resources we're discussing in today's show, along with more information on David Hitchcock and links where you can follow his work, are packed into the episode page for this week's show at CassidyCash.com/episode 419. Don't forget, while you're there, to click that Shakespeare Society and join us inside our members area for even more history. Again, that URL is CassidyCash.com/EP419. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.